like Americans are known to be very friendly. At least in France, we think they're like overly friendly, too friendly, because we're kind of very. I feel like we're seen as very rude, but it's not rudeness. It's just that we are not overly welcoming to people. If I don't know you, I'm not gonna say hi to you in the street or things like that.
Welcome to another episode of the Orbital Media Podcast, where we learn about the people of the world, what they do, and their cultures one interview at a time. If you aren't subscribed yet, consider doing so that we can continue to make more content. Today we're going to be talking about France and French culture, as well as what it means to be French in a broader sense. We're going to talk about language, family, food, social life, social etiquette, etc. Basically, a lot of the differences between France and other Western countries, as well as sort of cultural aspects of France itself. Today, I'm joined by Suzon Charbonneau. Did I get that roughly correct?
Yeah, that's good, yeah.
Okay. And I'll refer to you as Suzon, if that's okay. Slight American pronunciation there. So, Suzon, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me, Chris. I'm happy to be here and talk to you about my country, one of my two countries, because I was actually born in Belgium, but I grew up in the south of France. But I was raised with both culture, and for people who don't know the countries, you'd be surprised of the differences between the two cultures. It's similar in a broad sense, but then you have some specific things that are different. I was born in Brussels, which I hope you know is the capital of Belgium and also the capital of the EU. And I grew up in the south of France in a medium-sized town. Well, it's medium-sized for France. It would be a very tiny town for the US, and it's a town called Nîmes. And now I'm currently living in Avignon, which is another famous town in the south of France.
Yes. And actually, yeah, if you want to spend more time talking about differences, for example, between Belgium and France, since obviously those are very kind of related regions. You know, I always use sort of like the US-Canada analogy. I think of sort of southern Belgium as sort of like it's like the Canada of France, where you're going to have about the same culture, but there are going to be little differences. And
exactly,
yeah. So I'm kind of curious. Curious about that.
Say that because I haven't lived obviously in the US. I hear how Canadian people are so much nicer, and it's the same thing here in France. We say that Belgians are nicer than French people, so it's actually really funny.
Yeah, there seems to be sort of a running theme with that. I think of Australia and New Zealand same way. The people from New Zealand are like they're just nicer. They're the stereotype is they're much more kind of polite and they're a little bit less brash. But
exactly,
maybe something about a big country where people are trying to kind of make a name for themselves makes them maybe act slightly differently. So I mean, I guess if you want to talk either about France or Belgium, but if you were meeting someone for the first time, let's say, I think most people they've certainly heard of France, they've heard of Belgium, they're going to have maybe some cultural touch points. But still, if you said I'm French and they say like, oh, okay, like that's interesting, like is there anything you'd sort of follow up with? I'm like, so I'm French. This is like what you maybe you should keep in mind.
It's not so much something you should keep in mind though, but it's that every time I say I'm French, people say, "Oh, so you live in Paris?" And
interesting. Okay.
Yeah, it's immediately the go-to. People say, "Oh, so you live in Paris? You're from Paris?" And it's the biggest town. It's our capital, obviously. But I'm not from Paris, and most people you're gonna meet, French people you're gonna meet outside of France, are not gonna be from Paris. So that's the first thing I'd have to say is every French people you meet is not from Paris.
That's a great point. I mean, I think my whole life I've been to France 3 times and I've been to Paris twice, but 2 of those trips I very much spent my time outside of Paris. And I mean, I don't know, just a hot take here. I actually much prefer France outside of Paris.
Yeah.
I find it like France outside of Paris actually is really, really nice. Yeah, it's really nice. I actually really like it. Yeah, Paris is sort of you want to visit. It's there's interesting stuff there, but it's not.
Yeah.
I wouldn't live there.
Yeah, it to me, it feels like Paris is like New York to the US.
Yep.
So it's a big town. There's a lot of culture, art. Obviously, a lot of people go there for their career and things like that. But as much as you like it, you might not want to live there. And it's not the only thing great about America. It's not only New York. So it's the same here.
Mm-hmm.
Paris is a beautiful city. I mean, it's the city of love, but you have a lot of nice things outside also.
Yeah. I would absolutely agree with that. So, would you like to talk about sort of France in general, or if you want to focus actually on the south of France, sort of around like the area of Nîmes, Avignon? It's kind of up to you.
Yeah, we can talk about France in general. I think something else that might surprise Americans or people not familiar with France is that actually there's two kind of territories in France. So you have the continental country, which is the most famous, which is like France, the old country, and then you all have all the what we call dom-tom, which are the overseas territories in France. So you have some islands in the Caribbean. I think there's a country, like there's territory in South America. And all those
French Guiana in South America.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And so they're all part of France, but they're less known. And they're obviously, those territories are under the French government supervision. They're not independent, and those countries obviously come from colonization. So
yeah. I mean, I think if I remember, France is, I think it has like the most. I don't know if it's not like territory on planet Earth, but there's some metric that the French actually have the most of because they've got like this whole chunk of the South Pacific that takes up just like a tremendous amount of like the surface area of planet Earth.
Yes, because of the territories around like the sea, I don't know how many kilometers that is around the islands, but yeah.
I think that now that you're saying, I think that's what it is they have the most amount of like sea ownership of like any country in the world. Because it's not like Russia, it's not China, but for sea ownership, I think they have like the most. Yeah, that is true, right? That it's not like, because with the US and the UK, like it is, they will have stuff like that, but there's some element of like, it's not literally counted as, exactly the same thing as like the 50 states, or it's not exactly counted as like the UK proper. There's like a special designation for a lot of those things. But my understanding in France is there's a lot less of that. It's like, nope, that's just part of the country.
Exactly. So if you compare it to the Commonwealth, the overseas territories don't have as much independence as the Commonwealth countries. So those French overseas territories, they don't have prime ministers, they don't have their own laws. They all are like fall under the French government, which is based in Paris. And even in terms of region, within the old country, so the continental country, all the regions, we have what we call deputies and we have mayors and all this, but the power is in Paris and the power is within the French government. So that's the president and then the first minister and then all the other ministers that we have. But the regions don't have as much power as the Commonwealth or states in the US, for instance.
Also, please correct me if I'm wrong here, also Germany, I understand, which is also a federal state, and their states, but I eventually I actually want to talk to someone from Germany and get clarification on that.
Yeah, I think Germany, I don't know a lot about Germany, but I do feel like German regions have a little bit more power than we do in France.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I was reading it's the difference between what's called like a unitary state and a federal state, and that France is a unitary state, meaning that there are regional areas don't really have local control. It's all just like what happens in the capital, whereas a federal state is like a specific region can do a lot of things kind of on its own. And the US is like probably the most extreme example of like a federalized state, though I guess there are others as well too, but the US for sure is the famous one.
It was one of the things that was really surprising to me when I first learned about the US in school and then moved there eventually, is how much power the state has in terms of laws and all this. And it's always been crazy to me that you just go to another state and the laws are completely different. And you're still in the same country, but you don't have the same rights, even as a woman, for instance, and, obviously with the abortion and all that. And it's really insane to me that you can still be in the same country and not have the same rights as your neighbors in other states. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and I guess actually to that point, I'm curious because you obviously you lived in the U.S. for a little bit. You're back in France now. You were in the U.S. for graduate school, to study film and TV, and that was how long were you in the U.S. in total?
Was in US for a year and a half before that for my undergrad. Total, I think I'd say about 2.5 years I've spent in LA specifically. I've traveled across the States, but I've only lived in LA. Yeah.
And so one of the things you mentioned that you thought was really interesting was this idea of the concept of states with these really, really different laws depending on where you live. Were there other aspects, obviously there are things I'm sure we can think of that really struck you as interesting or different, things that you maybe liked and things that you maybe didn't like?
There's one that I was not expecting. I honestly was not expecting to have so much differences in culture. Because to me, the US is a Western country. We kind of have general social norms that we share. But when I moved to LA, I was really surprised how relationships between friends are and how different they are from friends. Like Americans are known to be very friendly. At least in France, we think they're like overly friendly, too friendly, because we're kind of very, I feel like we're seen as very rude, but it's not rudeness. It's just that we are not overly welcoming to people. If I don't know you, I'm not going to say hi to you in the street or things like that. And so when I first started having friends in the US, like for instance, there's an example that I still remember to this day is I moved, that was in undergrad. So I was living with 6 other girls. They were all Americans. And I remember that one of my roommates told me, I don't know, not really arguing, but we're talking about something. And she told me, look, Suzon, I love you, but I'm not going to do that. And I remember just being very shocked because I barely knew her and she just told me she loved me. And that was very weird to me. And I didn't know if she actually meant it or if it's just a way of speaking. Because in France, if I say I'm your friend, if I say I love you, I really mean it. And so we wait a longer time to say that. And the meaning of the word, the value it has, the power it has is higher in France than it is in the US. And that was really kind of disturbing to me because I didn't know if she really liked me. It was kind of, or if it was just the way of speaking.
Yeah, I mean, I think from my sense that would likely have been more of a way of speaking rather than a sense of actual, like, oh, you're this really, really close person to me. It probably almost would be translated to something like, look, I think you're cool. Like, you seem like a good person, but like, hey, I'm not going to do this thing. Which in
hindsight, now I know, but at the moment I was very disturbed. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it is interesting. There's sort of this idea, not that I've studied a lot, but this concept of like high context culture and low context culture, where in a high context culture, everyone usually, they know there are a lot of these like unspoken social cues and concepts of like how you're supposed to behave. And everyone kind of knows what those things. In a low context culture, that sense is we assume nobody kind of knows anything. So we're just, we act in a very kind of different way. And the sense is that the US and arguably actually some other European countries, the stereotype is Germany as well, but like certain of those northern kind of Germanic countries are very like low context culture where people are just very like, we're just going to sort of act in a slightly different way than like high context cultures, which would be like France and Japan, I think Italy, Spain, where there's a lot more of like, we all are in on these set of values and ways of behaving that we all know to do when we're around each other, but outsiders don't necessarily know what that looks like. And they might make in our eyes a lot more in the way of like social faux pas, which seems to be sort of it would seem to me at least one difference, but my understanding is that the US is sort of very famously this very low context culture, partly because you have lots of these different people who've kind of all shown up. So there has to be sort of a very low bar for entry in terms of like what do people understand as like the basics of how people interact, and that also with some amount of self-selection bias there can be in this idea of like Americans are very they're very like strangely high energy, I understand, is sort of like a stereotype that some people talk about, where they're like, why are you so excited about this?
Yeah. And it also goes into the way French people react when you tell them a story. And I've noticed that is when I talk to my American friends and I tell them a story, there's a lot of, oh my God, oh yeah, no, really. And when you tell a story to a French person, they're gonna wait. They usually, there might be a smile or like a little nod or something, but there's not gonna be this overly exciting, like expression or like sounds. We're just gonna nod and smile, and then if it's really a big, huge, juicy story, we might react. But usually, we're just nodding to make sure we're listening, but we're not gonna comment everything. And so I remember listening to my American friends telling me a story, and them being like, "Are you listening?" Like, and I was like, "Yeah, sure, I'm listening." It's just I'm being quiet because I'm listening, and so it's funny. Those situations are funny, yeah.
Yeah, are there other? I'm just curious if there's sort of other things like that, other of these sort of differences that you didn't know to expect, or maybe you kind of expected it, but still when it happened, you thought, "Oh, isn't that interesting?" And it can also be like negative stuff too. Like we don't, we can play in a box here that's not just like everything's amazing. Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah, I think I was not expecting how important identity is to Americans, especially knowing that it's such a young country, and it's has a very complex and violent history. Obviously, it feels to me that people are really very not obsessed, but it's very specific about their identity, which is very interesting to me because, for instance, I was born in Belgium. My mom's Belgian, my father was French, but I would never call myself Belgian French or French Belgian or But here in US, obviously, you have Asian Americans, you have African American, and then Latinos, and then so you have all those categories of identities and origins and where people come from, which we don't really label in France. We don't really identify ourselves this way. So obviously, if you're in France and you have an accent, people are gonna ask you where you're from, but they're never gonna like label you as much as I've heard people label themselves in the US. And I was not expecting that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and also with the US too, I mean, it's probably less true now, and it's certainly less true in California, but for a long time, and especially I think still in the Northeast, even amongst white Americans, you have the whole national identity element there, which is like, oh, I'm Italian American, I'm Jewish, I'm Irish American.
Exactly.
Yeah. Like, and then the one I understand a lot of Europeans find funny is the Americans where they're like, I'm 1/4 German, I'm one half Italian, I'm one half Polish, like, and Europeans, right? Like Europeans will always laugh whenever you mention that for Americans.
Yeah,
that's actually very interesting because obviously with France and especially I think for a lot of European countries, I've thought certainly for even more than 100 years, like you've had different groups of people who live in France that weren't like sort of that kind of I guess like the French ethnic group. Because you have people from North Africa, you have people from Italy, you have people from Spain to a certain degree. But your sense is that so if you were, let's say, North Africa, let's say you're from Algeria or you're from Italy, and you live in France. A lot of people, obviously, from those countries live in France. If you had an accent, like, what would your sense be of like how would people kind of deal with you? And what would I know there's also a range too, like your feeling of like how French are you? Because I get there's a that's obviously a very muddled topic now too, especially.
Okay. So there's I feel like there's 2 points to that question. The first one is racism in France is really different than it is in the US. It's there. It's French people are racist. It's I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but it's very different. I feel like it's less. Yeah.
It really is. It's kind of in all places
unfortunately,
of the world.
Unfortunately, it is. It's less in your face in France. It's more subtle, unfortunately. So it means that sometimes you might be a victim of racism and not even realize it because it's a little bit more subtle. And especially because we don't have as much police brutality as you might have, and things like that. And the guns are not legal here,
Yeah.
except if you're a hunter and things like that. So we have less events of blunt, just pure racism, though we still have them, obviously. And so all this to say, in terms of if you have an accent and how you look like, it depends where you're from. If you speak French with an Italian accent or a Spanish accent or even a German or an English accent, people are going to think it's cute. It's cute. You're like foreign. There's something exotic.
I'm trying to think of sort of equivalents in the US. But I don't know, the US is in some ways it's a very particular country. I mean, I've been trying to sort of learn a bit more about European elements of that and this dynamic, because obviously it's become more of a interesting topic where you are starting to get sort of different groups of people that are in different parts of Europe. And like, how does that affect sort of the general social structure of the countries?
Racism in France, so as I said, I feel like it's less in your face, and it's directed a lot to religion. Actually, people are very racist towards Muslims in France, and if you look Arab, or if you look like you're from the Middle East, people are going to be more racist towards you. It's a complicated story too, because when you take Algeria used to be a territory of France. It was invaded at some point by the French government, so it was part of France, but it was treated as less of other region. It was treated differently. Then there was a war, and then there's a civil war also, and so a lot of people moved from Algeria, moved to France, and were treated very poorly by the government. They were put in those like high buildings. It was kind of like, yes, we welcome you, but we're gonna put all of you in those buildings, and then we don't want you to mingle with us. That's created tension between people from Northern Africa and people who, white French people, I would say. Yeah.
This was something I was reading just a couple days ago, actually, which was that, and it was just some YouTube commentator about that he was claiming that Algerian Maghrebi people in France were per capita slightly less religious and slightly better integrated than other groups of North African and Arab Muslims in France. Is there something about that?
And that's also the thing with France, and the difference with the US is that you cannot ask people their ethnicity or what you would say race in the US. If you use the word race, which is the same spelling in French, and you say race, if you use it, then it means you're racist, or it's racist to use the word race. So that was also a big difference when I moved to the US, and everyone was using race left and right, and I was like, oh my God, what's going on? Because if I say, I'm from a different race than you, it means that I'm saying I'm a human and you're not a human. That's what it says. That's what it means. So we don't use that word as much. But to come back to that, I don't know how you call that, but when you have to fill paperwork in the US, they ask you if you're like white European.
The census forms,
Those are forbidden by law in France. So that's also, there's not an exact number, so I couldn't tell you, mostly Algerian. But it's true that from my experience, Algerians are a little bit more maybe used to French, like white traditional French race, but that's also because it used to be part of France at some point.
It was just an interesting point, because again, I know something about North Africa. I know more about I'd say most parts of the world. I know about it historically, but I know less about it sort of in like the modern world. But it was interesting, because the differences between like Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and it was just an interesting comment about like, Algerians are slightly better integrated than like Moroccans, for example. Which
maybe
maybe.
But it's actually really
Let's just get fun.
It's interesting because I was listening to an interview from a Algerian author, and she was saying that Arab is used as the language of speaking, but when you write, it's usually French. So that was also interesting.
Total aside, but I think I was talking to someone yesterday about the actress Sofia Boutella, who's I think French Algerian. She was in The King's Man and a couple other things. But she had a quote about she's like stuff I do to be an actress and stuff. But I think I remember she's French Algerian. I'm also really curious to talk about, being that I'm Anglo-American on my side, the French-Anglo rivalry and the view of, French people and the United States and the United Kingdom and those sorts of places.
Yeah.
So from other sort of kind of non-Western areas of the world, right, there's often been this lumping together of like the US, UK, Canada. It's just like, it's all the same thing. France obviously is a Western country, and you talked about like you noticed there were differences when you came to the US, and you were kind of honestly surprised by that because you're seen as sort of very much a core Western country. But there's also, of course, the crosstown rivalry, right? Shall we say, as I kind of put it, that like we were big rivals in high school and now we're friends kind of idea. But does that still track a little bit when French people think of, like, do they lump Americans and Brits still together a little bit, or do they very much view like Americans are their thing and then Brits are kind of their thing?
No, I think to us they're two different countries and they don't work together as much as they used to. But what I've noticed is for both countries, French people love to hate the US and love to hate the UK. And we love to make fun of them, but we also really like them. So it's the same, we make fun of Americans. We're like, oh, Americans are so stupid. But we consume Americans. We use American English expression more and more in our day-to-day life. When we talk to friends more and more. And so it's the same for the UK. We just love to make fun. Like, for instance, it was the coronation of the king.
Charles.
And we love to make fun of that, but we also kind of like it because we don't have it anymore. So it's a love-hate relationship. And yeah, we love to make fun of that.
Yeah, I would describe it as sort of a very similar thing kind of with, Brits and Americans. But I think probably the British more so. I mean, again, so in my family, I'm sort of very much in the kind of British American area. Yeah. And from my personal experiences, I think Americans, especially for sort of not to stereotype kind of like upper class Americans, there's more of just active dislike of France. Is
really?
My general sense. Yeah, this is more if you went to like we're talking about not like the sort of the very like kind of shishi coastal elite like rich kind of educated Americans. You go much beyond that. I would argue there's more like active dislike of France, not in like a literal sense of like like North Korea or something, but in the sense of like understanding that you're sort of, it's like a fellow Western kind of person in the friend group. It's like, oh, that's the that's the person in our friend group we don't like that kind of an idea. Whereas I think in the UK and amongst sort of the, again, I know in the US you're not supposed to say like the upper class or whatever, but basically like at this point, like the US upper class, there's much more of a sense of, as you described it, it's like, it's more of like a fun kind of rivalry. It's like, oh yeah, it's like, the people, we had a bit of a thing with them in high school, but like now we're good. And there's, I think, more of an active sort of enjoyment of very much with the food and with sort of the general, like the literature and the culture and like the artwork and sort of the high end sort of aspects of life that, France is still always very much held in very high regard in that sense. But I think, to generalize, that's more true in the UK and amongst, like the upper echelons of the American kind of coastal elite. It's less true, I think, for a lot of other Americans, at least in my estimation.
But I'm curious, what's the things the upper class doesn't like about French people? What's that stereotype? That
I mean, this stereotype is, I would say, the stereotype is that, and it's almost like, because this is a narrative that so many, I think, American and to a lesser degree British kind of tourists have had, which is, you go to Paris and everyone's like rude to you. It's sort of it's the idea, that's really what it is. It's you, and I mean, honestly, even the kind of time I went to Paris a couple of times, like it happened to me a little bit, which is just like, I think compared to somewhere like kind of like New York or certainly LA, but a lot of the big American cities, going back to the idea almost of like high context, low context, identity. And as we've talked about, sort of in the US, there's still a huge association with like national origin, racial identity, that kind of thing. France, as you said, it's a more complicated thing. But what you do still have, and this is a sense I would have, is that you have a very high level of not necessarily ancestry based, but I hate to say nationalism in France, because we've now considered nationalism this very Second World War kind of dirty word. And I don't mean it in that context, but a sense of kind of like in the US actually, like we're from this country, like we're amazing kind of an idea. And so I think the stereotype that and again, Americans have a ton of that too. But the stereotype is when you go to France, the French people, regardless of what their ancestry background are like super intense about the fact that they're French. And when they find out that you're American, they get very snobby and they look down their noses at you. And they're like, "Oh yes, you're American. You don't know how to speak French." And everyone's just like, "Fuck you!" Like, we're here on vacation, damn it, And that's from the American side of things, what is often seen as the negative aspect of the French. It's, and I'm going to generalize probably, I think, more for like the, as I said, the not upper class, like American population. The sense is that they think that the French think that they're better than other people, which is very much true of what I think a lot of people think about Anglos too. Just like Anglos think that they're better than everybody else. As it go back to that universal thing of like the Japanese think that they're better than everyone else, the Chinese think that they're better than everyone else. A lot of places think, I think especially places that have very, and I get this is maybe not so politically correct to say in certain circles, but countries that have very sort of intense history of like, look at all the things that we've done, tend to be pretty much like, go us, like we're great.
Yes.
And certainly, that list isn't like 50 countries long for current countries. It's, maybe like 15 or 20. And like France is absolutely on that list, as is the US, as is, Japan and the UK and China, right? So you're going to have, I think, that just in any of these cultures. But the stereotype, I think, with Americans is you have way more of that in France than you do in, for example, like Italy or Spain. Or, like Denmark or the Netherlands. Like you go there and people are just like, "Oh, hello, like welcome to our country." Whereas in France, they're just like, "Oh no, like you're Americans." Like, "Oh, well, now we're gonna remind you that you're not, you don't have food that's as good as our food," like that kind of a thing.
It's funny. All this makes me think of so many things that I actually wrote down. The first thing is I want to remind everyone, and I said that at the beginning, is that Paris is not France. In the same way that you couldn't summarize the US by New York. So people in Paris are known, even. I'm not from Paris, and when I talk about Parisian, I always say they're rude, they're snobbish, and they're like very bougie, look you up and down, criticize you. It's not always like this, but there's also this stereotype that if you're from Paris, this is how you are. And when I say we, it's people from the south. So I grew up in the south of France, and obviously every summer all the Parisians come down to the south because it's very nice to live, and you have the sun, you have the sea, and all this. And living in the south, you can spot a Parisian a mile away. And so it's also really funny. But so Paris is not France. The rest is really different. But it's true that French people have this, reputation of being rude. Being American, I would understand, because you love small talk. You love to, talk to people in the street, and we don't do it. When it comes to the language, I think French people still expect other people to speak French, because we used to be, a big country. We colonized a bunch of places, and so people used to speak French all across the world, and it used to be a very noble language.
And even just in Europe too. I mean, my sense is in kind of the 1700s into even the 1800s, it was sort of the official, kind of like English is essentially now, it was like the de facto second language that people went with.
Yeah,
for European diplomacy.
Exactly, yeah. When you would be in the noble circles, and a lot of kings and queens from across Europe, when you were in the court, people used to speak French. So that's where it comes from. And we forget that it's not the case anymore. So, and then then it makes me think I would say the same things for Americans, is that they travel everywhere in the world and just expect people to speak English. A lot of times that's going to happen. Yes. but I think French people love to say that we don't speak English because we want you to make an effort in the same way that you want us to make an effort.
I would agree. I mean, I think that the very well-deserved stereotype of Americans, and I think Brits to a degree, but especially here Americans, is the you go somewhere else and you don't even try. Like when you come to another country, and like I don't really like that. I don't think that's great. Even if it's just learning, like the minimum you can do is learn hello, do you speak English? Even if you even like for me that was Dutch. I think when I was in the Netherlands, the only thing I learned was like hello, do you speak English in Dutch, and that's all I know. I was like, at least I can learn it. It's not that hard. Yeah, it's interesting. What about France versus Belgium? I'm also just curious about this one because I mean I know Belgium itself. Obviously, I'll just preface with kind of here's what I know about Belgium. I was there for exactly like 2 days, like 12 years ago or something. Country, there is no Belgian ethnicity in the literal sense of the word. It's Dutch people and French people. Dutch in the north, French in the south. Brussels is just kind of at this point like a European. It's just like a European city.
It's there. It's just there.
It's there. It's a city. It's like it's almost just at this point we might as well just make it an EU special zone or something, and just it doesn't belong to any country. Yeah. So Dutch in the north, French in the south. My understanding is that the south, they're French, but they're just not politically connected to France. So they're their own country. It's like Switzerland, same thing. No Swiss ethnicity, French, Germans, Italians in a country, but you have French people who are nationally Swiss, but they're not politically French. In that sense, your parents, were they like Dutch Belgian or were they French Belgian?
My mother's French Belgian. The thing with Europe is that we share a lot of the same history because the countries they are right now used to be divided in region. So everything's a bit mixed in terms of history. So that's why you have Switzerland where, you have French, you have people speaking French and then Italian and then German. And it's the same in Belgium. Exactly as you said. So you have like Dutch, it's Flemish, basically Flemish speaking people, and then French speaking people. They don't really like each other. They kind of cohabit some way. They, it's like two roommates that doesn't really like each other. They don't really like each other, but they kind of need each other because they're already such a small country. If one part decides to be independent, they're not going to survive by themselves. And then Brussels, which is what I know most because that's where I was born and that's where all my family is kind of this very cosmopolitan city where you just walk in the street and you hear a bunch of different languages. Yeah. So it's this very weird, exactly as you said, it's just there. It's very strange, fun ambiance and dynamic of a bunch of people from different countries just in the middle of this tiny country where it rains all the time. So it's really fun. I really like it. Yeah. But a fun fact about Belgium is that it's still a monarchy.
Yeah.
So we still have a king, which holds basically the same power as the King of England. So it's more symbolic than anything.
Yeah. No, it's I think again I spent exactly like 1.5 days in Brussels, and I do remember walking by, like, I think it's the palace, right? And they have like the Belgian flag on top. But so in terms of, I would say, let's say France / Southern France or Belgium, for either of those, what would you say you'd feel I don't want to make you pick here because we can have like multi-hyphenate, sense of identity, but like if you were talking about culture that you were the most familiar with, so you were giving a general primer to like people who are listening about, here are some interesting aspects of like culture. Would you want to lean more towards Belgium or would you want to lean a little bit more towards kind of France?
I think France because that's where I grew up. So I was just in it and didn't really pay attention. Okay. So it's part of me, the French culture. But I also know my mother has a Belgian accent, which I don't even pay attention to anymore. But my friends always say, "Oh, your mom has an accent." I'm like, "What are you talking about?" So even things like that, it's, as a child, you don't really pay attention. But when I see the difference is more so in terms of my behavior. I think Belgian people tend to be more fun. They're more relaxed. They have this small country. They just love it's raining all the time. They just love to drink and have food, and they love to make fun of themselves. So they have a lot of humor. I think they're generally more relaxed and more chill and laid back. Not saying that they're lazy or anything, but in comparison to French people who seem a little bit uptight.
Yeah, it's interesting. What other, would you say, like national character or even just like cultural differences are there between these, it's very similar but slightly, separate kind of cultural areas?
Yeah,
you got humor and kind of general, like, how do you carry yourself? But like, I don't know, anything else?
I think the food, and that makes me think of your question earlier about differences within region. You can see there are small things about food in France that you can see where people are from. So in Belgium, you cook with butter. You put butter in everything. It just makes everything taste better. So when I think of my grandmother's cooking in Belgium, I think of butter. But for instance, in the south of France, where I grew up, Nîmes, it's a region that's very influenced by Spain. And so a lot of people cook with olive oil. And so the specialties, food that you would find in the south of France are tomato-based or olive-based.
Yeah, I love talking about food. I really enjoy trying different kinds of food.
And you have to talk. I mean, if we're talking about France, you have to talk about food for sure. I have plenty to say about food. So just
like you have to talk about the fact that, in my opinion, the Belgians make the best beer in the world. But the French beer is generally not. I would generally consider it to be not as high quality. But their wine is obviously, in first place, which is, to me, that's a fascinating thing. You got people from roughly the same culture. One of them, they make the best beer, but you don't ever think of, like, I don't think of Belgian wine. You think of Belgian beer, and then you think of French wine, but you don't think of French beer.
Speaking of climate, in France, we're a relatively small country, but we are very lucky in terms of our climates because we have 4 climates. And so if you have the oceanic climate and then the Mediterranean, which is different in the south, and then you have the continental climate, and then you have mountains. So it's different. So in each
just
of these
for the listeners, so we know, can you take us through, and we'll put a map up, but take us through kind of, in what region would we find each of these 4 climates?
The Mediterranean climate obviously is going to be all that south part, which is going from Spain to Italy. And so you have the Mediterranean Sea. So that's the south of France. And then you have southwest and all the west coast, basically, which that's the Atlantic.
Okay. Yep.
And that's the oceanic climate. And then if you go towards Paris, for instance, but then not Paris, because obviously it's a town, but if you go down, all that's the continental climate. And then we have 2 major mountain chain. I think that's how they're called.
Mountain chains, yeah.
Yeah. So you have one, you have 3. You have one
next
to Spain. And so that's left,
Pyrenees.
south, left, and west. Yeah, exactly. And then you have the Alps in Switzerland and Italy. It goes down to Italy. Yeah.
So that's the climate. Now, how does that, to go back to sort of like food and drink, how does that affect the food and drink?
It allows us to have different kinds of wine and to grow different kinds of grapes. So for instance, in the south, there's a rosé that my mom really likes that grows in the sand. So that's going to give a different taste to the grape, obviously. It's a rosé that's very clear. It's very pale. It's sometimes it almost look like, some tinted water, and it's really good. It's very smooth, subtle taste. And then you obviously have Bordeaux, and then all the coast of the Rhone, which you have more tasty wines, red wines, also white. But so all those different climates, they allow you to grow different grapes. And in such a small country, having so many different climates, it allows you to grow so many different varieties. And so that's how we were able to develop our wine. And when you look at Belgium's a tiny country. It's flat. It's actually, there's a very famous Belgian singer, Jacques Brel, which I grew up listening. He has this very famous song. He talks about Belgium, and the song's title is "The Flat Country." That's Belgium. It's flat. There's no mountains, like pretty much none, and it rains a lot. It can be a little warm in the summer, but so you don't have a climate that's very good for wine.
Yeah.
But for beer, it's better. You know.
So interesting to me is how, right, given how small of a country Belgium is, like, why are they so good at making these beers compared to a lot of other, you know, like,
I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, it's I'll have to figure that out, you know, because obviously as a big fan of sort of craft beer, like, you know, and there are different styles, obviously, like the Belgians have their style, sort of German Czech or German style, and then kind of German Czech style, and then you got, you know, sort of, I'd say English, kind of Scottish and Irish. There are different versions there, but yeah, the Belgian ales, just they're often just seen as like the best in quality.
They're good. They're really good. Yeah.
But yeah, so we'll have to figure that out. But yeah, the microclimates in France, that kind of makes a lot of sense for why you have like sort of really good quality in the way of wine, and in a country that's relatively speaking not very big.
Yeah, no, it's small. I mean, and when you look at Europe, it's average, it's good. Germany is bigger, it's a way bigger country, but it's good size. But obviously, you look at the US, it's like, I don't know, 3-4 times the size of France. It's more than that, probably.
Easy. You know. It's huge, yeah. But even compared to, you know, other wine growing countries, like I'm thinking like Australia or Argentina or Chile, like, you'll have lots of different varieties, but those are also geographically very big countries where, I mean, there might be like a wine growing region, but it takes up like a lot of space compared to France. And then I would also say Italy and Spain, where you're getting into like really small, like it might be a single valley that like does just one thing very, very particular. Yeah. Though again, I'm certainly, I enjoy wine, but I'm not like a wine expert, and I'm, you know, curious to just learn more about it.
Yes, my understanding is that Spain and Italy have a relatively similar climate. They grow similar grapes and have similar wines, which I really like. Usually very good red wines, very strong tannic red wines. Yeah. Right.
Because they're very, it's more of a hot, dry climate. I'm generalizing there, obviously, like northern Italy, like it rains plenty in northern Italy, and I'm aware like northern Spain, like it can be very cold there. So that's a generalization, but more so compared to France, it's gonna be hotter and drier. I've never been to Bordeaux, but my sense is that is sort of right. It's more of an oceanic kind of climate. It's not a Mediterranean place.
No, absolutely not. No. Yeah.
And then in terms of food, and I want to go into sort of Belgian food here for a second. So as a sort of, you know, outsider, kind of American person, the association I had with Belgian food was molle frites, as just like, and then waffles.
Yeah. For instance, when I think of my grandfather, I think of potatoes, because potatoes are everywhere in Belgian food. My grandfather needs his potatoes at least once a day. They can be cooked, like just steamed in water. They can be fries. They can be cooked on a pan. They can be cooked whatever way you want. But yeah, it's potatoes. So that's French fries, or, you know, Belgian fries. I don't know why they call French fries, because really, even in Europe, Belgium is seen. Oh, you can tell me. I want to know. Tell me. I want to know.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is supposedly how the story went. So the Belgians invent French fries, which, as you say, I'm calling them French fries. American soldiers in World War I believe, not World War II, but World War I, they show up and they're fighting in Belgium, right? Obviously, Belgium was sort of ground zero for like the horrors of the Western Front type stuff, right? Which we don't have time to get into that on this podcast. It's a horrible topic. But so these American soldiers, Doughboys was the nickname for World War I, are fighting in Belgium, and the people around them are speaking French. So they're thinking, and these people who are speaking French have these little sliced fried potato things. And so the Americans are like, oh, these are French people because they're speaking French to me. And they're giving us these little fried things. These are French fries. And they take them back to the US. And they're like, hey, guys, we got these things. They're called French fries, because everyone who was talking to us was speaking French. And they didn't know that they were in Belgium. And so, but the name stuck. And so now Americans knew them as French fries.
See, that makes me think of one of the biggest stereotypes that unfortunately is kind of true is that Americans are stupid. But what I mean by stupid is that they don't know anything about the rest of the world. And they're very egocentric that way. And so obviously they would think that every country where someone speaks French is France, and they wouldn't know, exactly. They wouldn't know that Belgium is right there and it's another country. Yeah. That's funny.
Yeah. The thing that I was actually going back to the idea of food and America and France and all that I was shocked by when I went to Belgium and the Netherlands and in France as well, was how obsessed people were with pommes frites, with French fries. Because there was this idea, growing up in the US, where the sense of like, if you were considered like, oh, like I'm a smart person, right? Where like French fries and like pizza and sort of these things which were viewed as like obviously super American food that people knew, like they're aware, like, okay, we know that pizza's from Italy. People weren't like that kind of ridiculous, but there was a sense of like, oh, well, that must be just one of these American things. And like nobody in Europe would ever eat something like that. And then I showed up in France and Belgium and the Netherlands. And I'm like, not only do people eat French fries, they're more obsessed with French fries here than I would say they are in the US.
Yeah, but that's because it's been there for a while, and we've loved it and we've eaten it way before American soldiers discovered it in Belgium, and we're very specific about how to cook it. So my grandfather has this technique where he cooks them twice. So he cooks them once, I don't know how many minutes, and then before the dinner, and then once the dinner's ready, he's gonna put them back in it, and so they're extra crispy. So that tells you how important that is for him and for Belgium. But we like them very crispy. We like them homemade if possible. And yeah, in every bistro, even in Paris and even in every town, you're gonna have a steak with French fries, and they're usually really good.
Steak fleet, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Steak frites or entrecôte frites. Yeah. It's one of those meals you're gonna see everywhere. But I would say we're very specific about how we cook it, more so than in the US. In the US, it's just like, well, it's fries,
There's a range, yeah. People will still have preferences, and there's sort of the whole
it's
thing
like
about
curly,
this fast
curly
food chain makes terrible fries,
exactly,
and this fast food chain, their fries are amazing. Like people will still have their preferences, but yes, it's way more. There's not like a national standard. It's just like do what you want. People will still decide probably what they prefer, but it's not like codified in the same way in terms of the style. There's a wide variety of like what people are going to be doing. Yeah.
Speaking of food, I have to talk about our obsession with food and the differences I've seen with how we consume food in France and in Belgium, and how food is consumed in the US. I've noticed that food in the US is really, not all the time, I'm generalizing obviously, but it's a fuel. It's like, okay, you have to eat, I need to put some food in my body, and then I have to go. And so you go to a restaurant, you sit down, someone's already there to take your order. 10 minutes later, you have your food and the bill with it. And it was really shocking to me that I would barely just get my food and not even eating it, and already have the check. Because if someone were to do that in France, it means I need you to get out of the restaurant. So it's very rude. But it plays into that bigger picture of food as fuel in the US, whether in France, it's an art. We literally called it l'art de la table, which is the art of the table. And so food is really important. It's a social moment for us. And so we like to enjoy it. And that's part of our culture as well, is that we like to take our time. And so if you go out to have dinner with your friends, you're going to be there for at least an hour and a half, 2 hours minimum. And you can spend 4 hours at the dinner table. It's not shocking whatsoever. And a waiter's never going to give you the bill if you don't ask for it. And so this whole way of going to the restaurant, way of consuming and of saying food, it was very interesting, and it's one of those things I really didn't like when I would go to a restaurant, and I would feel that they want me to get out as soon as possible. I wouldn't do it. I would still stay there and talk with my friends and everything, but it still felt like, okay, we need you to get out of here.
Yeah. That's really interesting that you mention that, because the point I was going to make is what you're sort of saying very much relates to this idea I have about going back to that older example of, like, at the sort of American upper class historically, there's been more of a French influence, but below that, it's very, like, the culture's very, very different. And that idea of sort of these very long, leisurely meals, I would associate with wealth and sort of like privilege and money in the US amongst like very, very financially successful people, where they will go out to like a Friday or a Saturday night dinner in like New York at like these really expensive, probably French or possibly like Japanese restaurants, but these like very, very high-end restaurants, and they'll be there for like 3 hours. But it's but it's very much a small portion of the population that does it. But it gets back to that idea of, I would argue, there being a better image of France and French culture amongst the sort of, to generalize here, like the educated, wealthy American elite that's been around for quite a long time, that really does not exist, I think, almost at all. If you go much, much below that. Maybe a little bit with like upper middle class people, like they might occasionally do that. They're like, "Ooh, we're going to a nice French restaurant. Like that'll be good." Like, you know, you get it with like a date kind of thing. But it's in a very particular environment that people will do that. It's like a treat to do something like that. And the rest of the time, yeah, absolutely. The sense is, even for like a reasonably decent restaurant, again, I think the more expensive the restaurant, the less you have that culture, the more there is that feeling, and partly because you're spending a lot of money, like you should be able to enjoy your meal. But absolutely, when you go much below like expensive restaurants, absolutely, that sense of just like you're always just on the clock. Like, okay, we're going to be here for an hour, and then we got to go, and we got to go do this other thing. And there's just, like a frenetic speed to things. Though the one other area, and again, this is to stereotype here, this is a little bit also sort of like a more European thing, where I would say you probably have a little bit less of that. It's not so much American food culture, but it's American sit-down coffee shops is one of a few places where I would feel you actually don't have that frenetic energy as much. And there is more of that sense of, even if like, you know, you shouldn't have your laptop and be set up for 4 hours with your one cup of coffee. Like there probably will be a point where they're like, okay, look, man, like you've been here for 2.5 hours. Like, can you please move on? There's less of that in your face frenetic energy in sit down, like, but again, nice coffee shops.
I think French people, you know, when you're asking how French people see Americans or English-speaking people. I think Americans to us are on the go. That's exactly how we see them. If they're on the go, it's fast food because it has to be fast. I need to be able to eat in my car. Never in a million years would I eat in my car if I'm not obligated to. Like, if I'm going on a road trip, I'm going to eat in my car. I'm just going to stop at a like rest stop and I'll eat in my car. But if I decide to even have fast food, usually you would go in the fast food restaurant and eat there, or you take it back home here in France. So that element of on the go, even coffee on the go is not very common here. It exists. We have Starbucks and things like that. But we like to sit down and enjoy our food and enjoy our coffee and take the time to do things. So that does mean sometimes we're a little bit lazy. We're lazy people, you know, we take a lot of time, but yeah.
I mean, it is sort of really that trade-off, which, I mean, we could even put that in the context of the stereotype here, sort of almost like a Northern European, Southern European kind of stereotype about sort of the kind of hardworking, a little frenetic, a little always on the go, kind of obsessed with, I mean, you know, Germans too, to a certain, you know, they definitely have a bit of that kind of, a little bit of that vibe. It's not quite the same as Americans. I think there's a bit of a divergence there, but you can see kind of how it comes from a similar place. But the trade-off is that, you don't enjoy life maybe as much, but then you're more, you could argue you're more like, quote, efficient, you know, in getting things done. But it's right. It's there's like probably a perfect mark to hit, but it's it's tough to get it. You're
It's
often
tough. It's really tough. It makes me think of, as I was watching the news, the French news. We've had a lot of strikes and demonstration for the retirement plan, or whatever it's called in English, but
it's probably the pension. Yeah, the pension plan.
Pension. Yeah, that's what I was looking for.
The pension plans. Yeah.
And this French journalist was interviewing an American talking about retirement, and this guy was probably 65 or something, maybe 70 actually, and he said, "I'll retire when I die." And that, to me, it was just so American. I was like, because you don't have pension. I mean, you have to put money in a pension fund. I don't even know how a 401k works. I'm glad I'm not there anymore, because I don't know how that works. There's a difference there also between French and American culture. I wouldn't know exactly how to define it, but it was really, I was really laughing. It was really funny to me that this guy was like, I'll retire when I die, and we're just arguing here because we don't want to work until 67, I think.
Yeah, because they upped it. It was by like 2 years. Because France did have, I think, like one of the lower. It was on the lower end, even for European standards, of like what the retirement. It was like 62 or something, right? And they upped it like 2 or 3 years.
That's one of the things that I really don't like about France, is how privileged we are and how much we don't realize how privileged we are. Speaking of pension, of retirement, it was 60 and then it was 65 for certain people, not all of them, and now it's 67. But mind you, we have what we call 37-hour work week here. 35. So legally, you're supposed to work 35. It depends what work you do. So my mom's a doctor. She's independent. She doesn't work in a hospital, so she can do whatever she wants. So she doesn't work. She works more than 35. But legally, it's 35 hours. 35 hours in a week, it's nothing. So you basically do like 9 to 5 with a 1 hour lunch break, and that's it. And then you can go home. So that's how people work. So it's 35-hour week. And then you have social security. So that means you have access to so much medical care. Obviously, there's a few things you have to pay yourself, but it's nothing. It's absolutely nothing. For instance, I broke my leg in September. I was supposed to get my surgery.
How are you doing?
In the US.
How are you doing, by the way? I mean, I know it's months later.
I'm good. I'm good. Yeah. I'm good. It's all good.
Because I was worried. I was worried about that. Yeah.
No, I'm all good. I'm fixed up. I finished physical therapy, but I'm good to go. It's still gonna take a bit of time. It still hurts every now and then, but I'm good. But so I was supposed to get surgery in the US. It was probably going to cost me $30,000, something like that, because I had insurance. It cost me less than 1,000 here. Yeah. And even less than that, because then you have extra insurance that you have to take, and then it's nothing. And just thinking you can go to the ER in France and get out with a bill of €0. Like, you don't have to pay a single thing. And so everything's made like that. Everything is very advantageous, and we are very privileged, but we want more. That's the thing. We want more. We want all of it. And that's annoying to me because, having lived in the US and then I was in Asia for a little while, also for a year, you see how you come back and you really appreciate how privileged we are, and you appreciate your country more. And it's just really annoying to me that the money has to come from somewhere. So if you want free healthcare, people got to work and they've got to pay for it. So you can't have everything and not work. It doesn't work like that. So
yeah. It's I think very much the case sort of here. I mean, obviously the healthcare issue has been a huge sticking point, and obviously large numbers of Americans are also very tired of it too. And that is sort of a kind of a well-deserved stereotype of one of these points where the Americans are just this total outlier in the Western world with healthcare, and something that a lot of Americans, I think more so than in previous decades, are like very aware of. That, like, it's not a good look. But it's just it's such a big country, and there are so many mechanisms at play to try to get this stuff through, to get it passed, that it's very hard. And then also the idea of like, okay, well, so there is a certain amount of scarcity. There are a certain amount of resources that we can have and that we can use. Like, it does have to come from somewhere. Things don't just magically like sprout out of the ground, which is, which I personally, I do think I have some issue with some of that like mindset that you do have amongst a lot of like, I'd say younger people in the US, but sort of just like, we want all these things and we just want them to happen. Like, we don't really want to do anything. We just want to have them. And it's like, well, no, you have to do stuff to get things. I also agree. Like, I think there should absolutely be a basic health social safety net for everyone in the country. But that's also going to come at a price. Like, you can't just magically like snap your fingers and that happens. And the example that a lot of people give is like, yes, and like your taxes will then, let's say, be way higher as a result of having that, which is often a trade-off in European countries. Like, you have way higher tax brackets.
Yeah, we pay a lot of taxes. Yeah.
And it's like, and that's part of the deal. Like, part of the deal is you pay more taxes to have the thing.
So you have basic taxes that everyone take, and then you have taxes based on where you live. And I know that in Nîmes, so the town I grew up in, my parents used to pay a lot of taxes. So the taxes were known to be very high there. But then, fortunately, we saw where the money was going because they renovated the whole town. So it's so much nicer now. So there's a lot of construction, but now you're like, okay, I'm actually paying for this and I'm actually seeing what I'm paying for. So it's great. But yeah, they would not have been able to do what they've done with the town had there not been, very high taxes. So in this case, it's great because you actually see where it's going. But that's also something I don't like and French people are really unhappy about, is that oftentimes you don't know where your taxes are going. And you pay a lot of taxes and you don't know where they're going. A lot of them are going towards the social security and healthcare. So we don't know where it's going, and I feel like we're losing the value of things, especially when it comes to healthcare. People go to the doctor for any reason here. They have a headache because they haven't had enough water today, and so they go to the ER. No, literally, it's like stupid stuff like that.
That's ridiculous. Yeah, like that's ridiculous.
It is ridiculous, but it's because they don't know how much it costs. They don't know the value of it, and but that's also very personal because my mom's a doctor, so I know how much it costs. But, it's like you were saying, I think there's a balance between France and then the US where you have nothing. I think we need to find it. To me, sometimes France is a little bit too on the extreme, on the other side, where people, they just don't know how much it costs. Yeah. In the US, you know too much how it costs.
I think that's a great way of putting it. Yeah. That in France is right. People they just expect all of these things. And in the US, everyone's like sweating bullets constantly about like, oh, if I do this thing, it's going to like cause, And like it should be somewhere in the middle, which is, you sort of, there should be and again, I want to say, like, I'm not talking about like just a total carte blanche, like everyone gets whatever you want all the time for health, but like the minimum, there's like a minimum standard. It's, not great, but like you get a minimum standard. And then above that, if you want to have like policies and pay extra, like, yes, you can get nicer things as you go up. You just have like the baseline so that the really serious stuff, you don't have people where like you could be able to like help people in serious conditions. And you're like, well, you don't have insurance. Sorry. I guess you're just going to have to die. Like, that's just a really, really like,
it's something I was actually wondering when I broke my ankle and a friend was with me and she's like, what do I do? I was like, well, just call 911. I couldn't move. And then I knew it was going to cost me money and I had insurance. So it was a fine. It was okay. It still cost me money. But I was just thinking, I was in my hospital bed and I was like, what do people do when they don't have insurance, when they don't have money? Like, cause I broke my ankle at 3 different places. I needed surgery. It wasn't a question. I needed to have that surgery if I wanted to walk. And so my question was like, what do people do when they don't have insurance? They don't have the means to pay for all those bills. Do they like have, borrow money and have death until the day they die? Or do they just don't go to the hospital? Like, what do you do? Because I needed it.
So I think it's probably all of the above. And I'm not, this is actually making me curious. I'd love to at some point to get someone on this show and talk to someone about like, let's get into the concept of like the American healthcare system. But so prefacing this as saying like, I'm not an expert on this. This is just kind of what I'm aware of is medical debt is a huge problem in the US. People who have been completely wiped out, completely bankrupted by it, where, yeah, like you get hit by a car and you aren't insured. We're talking about like not maybe you're literally dying, but like life ending type event in the scheme of you ever being able to like get back on your feet again, both physically and metaphorically, to like progress forward in, you know, what you want to achieve. That's absolutely a serious problem. And you're kind of just out of luck. Like, and this is, you know, to get into like the depressing aspects of like components, I would argue, of American society, there's a sense of like, well, sorry, like you're just gonna suffer, like your life is just like over now. And really, like, there's not like a different answer. It's just like, nope, that's just it, like it's that bad. Which is, you know, to generalize my sense, in not all countries around the world, but for other sort of comparatively developed countries, people often see that as like, what's wrong with Americans? Like, how do you have this mindset of your society? You know, that's something you'd see in like China, right? Where they're just like, oh, well, you just died. Like, sorry.
Yeah.
But and that's something, as I said, like that plenty of people in the US are keenly aware of, I think more so now. And that we're like, people are like, that's not okay. Like, that's just morally not okay. That's how things are set up. And I'm certainly in that category. Again, I completely agree with you. I think for more minor things, yes, you don't just want like everyone going to the ER because like, oh, I like sprained my wrist. Like,
no, yeah.
You don't need to go to the, like, you know, those sorts of things. But yeah, that concept of like a terrible thing happened to you and now you have no option. Now, I will say, and this has been, you know, in the last several decades, like depending on what state you live in, and this is again, this whole state thing, which is kind of weird. There are certain, obviously, you know, basically like Medicare, Medicaid programs, Medicaid being the one I believe that's for if you're just, you know, if you're like our age, right? And you can be on it. Now, you know, certainly in my 20s, like there was a couple of year period where like I wasn't really, you know, working at any major desk job, and like I was on Medicaid, and you know, and for basic like checkups and going to hospitals, like it pretty much covered all of that. That was in New York, and I think, at least from the paperwork, New York was much better organized, in my opinion, than California from going through the paperwork of it. But like New York, like you could be on that, it covered you. You could go to, you know, you could go to checkups, you could see a doctor, you could go to a dentist, all of that. Now, I don't know if you got like, again, if you fell 2 stories off of a building, you know, and you fractured your leg in 3 places, I don't know what would happen at that point. Like how much of that would be covered by this policy. So, you know, and that did change obviously a little bit with sort of the Obama administration passing things like, you know, Obamacare, as it became known. Where if you didn't have it, if you didn't have any insurance, then you'd like get taxed. Actually, it was like kind of, that wasn't great, but it did provide more low cost healthcare to people who otherwise probably wouldn't have been able to have at least such a basic level of care. Yeah. So it was an interesting, so that did change it a little bit, but it's still not quite at the level of again, not as an expert here on health, but you know, the stereotype of what you have in other countries. Though I do understand that there are issues there, like Canada now, like apparently the stereotype is there's tons of people just waiting. They're just on these wait lists. Like, oh yeah, it's a 3-month wait, 4-month wait, 5-month wait. Oh, you want to do things? Yeah, that's going to take like forever. And that is also a downside of it. So, you know, there is, right, there's probably a mark here that's not just like the total government controls everything, socialized stuff. And also not the, oh, you got hit by a car and you don't have insurance, well, I guess you'll just die. Like there's a mark that's probably somewhere between those two.
But we have that same problem. We have a massive shortage of doctors here, and you have a long wait. That comes from, I think, 2 things. One is medical school is very hard here in France, and the system hasn't been updated in decades. I think it's very old and should be updated because it doesn't work anymore. I have so many friends who wanted to be doctors, and it's basically like what we call a concours, which is like an entry test after the first year of med school. So the first year, just prepare for that test. And then you have a quota of people. It depends where you are in France. There's different institutes, like academies and things like that. Let's say you have 500 people that can get it. If you have very high score and you do 501, you're screwed. And so it's this. So this system that doesn't work anymore. So people go into Spain, they go to Romania actually to get their medical degree,
really?
and then they come back. And then a hospital in France are asking Romanian doctors to come work for them, or Spanish or doctors from Portugal, or it's like it's nonsense, because our people are going away to get their medical degree and they're getting foreign doctors. So it's like a bit of a nonsense. And it's also that doctors, like if you're a general doctor, like a family doctor, you're not paid very well. So it's this whole it's a bit broken system. But talking about medical care makes me think of something I didn't know, and I learned when I was in the US, is that the whole country is built on credit. And the concept of a credit score, that was very interesting to me. When I was looking for apartments, they were asking for my credit score. Obviously didn't have one because I was just moved to the US, and then I was living in a student housing, so that was fine. And then I started building my credit. But the concept of credit is very interesting to me, especially the way you use it. So obviously we have credit card in France, and if you were to buy a house, you would buy a credit, obviously. Or you can buy a car credit, or if you buy a couch and it's like 3,000 euros, you can buy a credit. But buying your groceries credit, buying, day-to-day things credit is a very foreign concept to me. And it just made me feel that everyone I'm generalizing, but a lot of people in the US were just living above their means and just being in debt constantly. And that also made me think of the price of school and university and colleges in the US, which is astronomical. And it just makes me feel that you're like, the youth is just forced to go into debt so early in their life, and then it's just a question of am I going to be able to pay all that back? And it just feels like such a problematic way of starting your life,
Yeah, the university issue is obviously, like healthcare, that's another sort of one of these massive points of kind of political football that's been kicked around for years and years and years now, because that is such a massive debt bubble that's just been forming from all of these people going to schools. And I've dug into that a little bit more than I have with medical. Like medical, I've just always, my whole life, I've just been very kind of ignorant about a lot of that stuff, other than just like, oh, do I have insurance? Okay, great. But with the debt bubble for university, that's a very complicated topic. In terms of why those costs have expanded so much and how things have, ballooned into these obscene levels of like, why are people paying $50,000 a year to go to universities? And even for sort of like not super high end universities, it's still like, oh, it's like $10,000, kind of thing. Which again, if you're a person where you're of very limited economic means, that's still a lot of money to be spending for a year of school. So that's a very complicated thing. There's the credit score, like that number, like your credit score is X, it's 600. And then there's tied to it the concept of, you're referring to like people using credit cards just constantly to pay for things, right? You're just like, oh, tap your credit card and pay for this thing. That idea of credit card debt and people just living above their means absolutely is an issue. I personally, maybe this would be like a debit card, which I'd be curious about. I really love the concept of increasingly like contactless, non-cash payment, where I just show up somewhere. Like I basically don't carry cash on me. I don't have physical bills. Like it's very rare that I ever have physical bills. I also personally make sure to live within my means. So like the concept to me of like taking on credit card debt, where you're not just like, oh, it's a cost and you just pay it, like is a strange foreign concept to me. But apparently, for a lot of Americans, that's like, no, you're just like, oh, I got to pay the minimum balance or whatever. And as you said, like, you're living above your means, which is kind of ridiculous. The question, I guess I have a question, which is, now maybe it's on a debit card, but I had heard that I think it was Germany. I don't think it was France. It was Germany. But that people there still used cash a lot. Like to the point where it was almost, and for American visitors, they found it really inconvenient, the amount of times they had to like go to a bank and like get it, like, oh, I got to stop what I'm doing because I have to go to a bank to like get out cash because I can't just, tap the card on things and like pay for stuff. Is that very much still the case in France, where it's like you're using euro bills very often to pay for, as you said, like regular, like, oh, I buy a sandwich, let me get out some bills, or is it just like, nope, just.
It's less and less. Yeah, we used to use a lot of bills, like actual physical bills. You're still gonna need them if you're in a small town, because the cost, or if you're in a small shop or things like that, because the cost, the taxes they have to pay on the credit card, like the card machine, and the fees they have to pay is too high for them, or too inconvenient for them. So it's small shops, small towns, but less and less. It's more and more, tap your card. It's like contactless or whatever. Yeah.
If it's a bank card, I think that makes sense. Yeah. But no, I think the idea of not having to go to the bank and get bills is, I think, just it's such a headache once you live in a world where you just you just press the magical thing and it just, we're done. But yeah, it's interesting if it's like debit versus credit.
Aren't people using bills in smaller towns in the US?
They are definitely more so. And that's actually something where I would say I probably also can't speak on that as much, since I've only generally ever lived in either big cities, or when I did grow up in the suburbs, that was as one community put it, like in the 90s, like you had credit cards, but it was like this whole thing you had to go through to use it. And there's a scene, it's I think Home Alone 2, where they have the big machine that goes like to like read the credit card, and it's like, but so the world of where it's just like everybody's got a card and you just contactless, just kind of everything. I've only ever really lived in big cities during that age in our modern world. Like if I went to like a small town in Iowa, like I don't know. That's actually a good. Maybe I'll add that question because I'm interviewing some other people from from different American states. And like. Yeah. But yeah, in even I'd say in like outlying regions of a big city, like my sense is now like similar to how you're describing it. If you go into a very small shop where they're not gonna, they're like, hey, it's a local business. You're gonna need to pay cash, or there's like a fee. That's one that I see a lot, where they're like, if you want to use a credit card, there's a 4% fee on top of whatever you're paying for.
They don't offer that option, because I think in France legally it's the store that has to pay for the fee. And what happens is that in a lot of shops they have a minimal for paying with a card. So they would say you have to spend $5 or 10, like €5 or €10 minimal to be able to pay with a card. Because that allows them to pay the fee and not lose money. Because obviously, if you're gonna go buy a baguette for like €1.10, the fee's might be too expensive for them.
Yeah. I suppose you have that here too. And actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I'm realizing that I think where I've seen the fee is more online purchases. Actually, that if I'm buying something online, I will see. Like, oh, if you want to buy this thing, or I've been a lot of bills, like a lot of my monthly bills, for some reason, they love tacking on we can either draw it from your bank or you can pay like a 4% fee. I'm like, oh, just fine, just draw it from my bank. But actually, the credit card minimum, I think, is more common here too. So it's like $10 minimum to use a credit card. Yeah.
When you say you're paying, when you're paying with a credit card, you have either pay 4% or they draw it directly from your bank, right? So they take it directly from your bank account. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. These are usually, again, this is usually not from a merchant. So I'm not, buying a new pair of shoes, or I'm buying, a pair of jeans or something. This is like a bill. You're paying your electrical bill, you're paying your rent, you're paying your, your internet, that sort of thing. Some companies will say like, oh, you can either pay with a credit card and we'll charge you like a 3 or 4% processing fee for that, or you can just put in your bank information and you just pay directly from your bank account, and then there's no cost there.
That's interesting. Yeah. So see, it goes back with the difference between credit and debit and how pronounced it is in the US. In France, it's usually debit, and I'm glad, and I prefer it for it to be debit, because at least when I'm looking at my bank account, I know exactly how much money I can still spend. I don't have to think of, oh, I have this credit card, I have to pay for it. So obviously we have credit cards. It's mostly in upper class where someone would have an American Express. And so they would use it to buy big things, a plane ticket or a couch or things like that. But then most people generally only have debit cards. They might have different accounts, different banks, but they would use debit, and it's just taken directly from your account. And so you know exactly how much you spent. So it was very interesting to me that I was pushed. If I wanted a credit score, I had to buy credit. And I didn't feel, it kind of made me feel insecure, like a bit worried. So I remember I would pay my credit card bills right back because I was scared I was going to forget about them because I was not used to it. So I was scared I was going to, get interest or whatever.
Yeah, if it's
late,
they'll charge you interest, and eventually, your score will go down. Again, I'm sort of in a similar category where I've always just lived my life of, I just view this as basically a debit card with one extra step, where it's just, I use it and then I'll just pay for it. And the only other thing is people always tell you kind of like, debit cards, people try to say like, don't use those because it's easier for people to steal your information. Credit card, there's like an extra step. But anyway, it's one of these where I just view it as like a thing that that's money that I'm spending. I don't view it as some like, it's not real, it's just credit. But I think, there are Americans like they kind of view it that way, which is not a good way to view it because it is money.
Yeah, it is money. And it makes me think of something else that I want to ask you is I've noticed, at least with my American friends, that because they use credit, they tend to buy things at the store and then return them very often.
Yeah, so
and
that's
it's not something we're used to do in France because we usually try it. And if there's a problem, obviously you're going to return it. But in the US, I really feel like it's, I don't want to try it on. I'll just take it, try it home. See if it, for instance, clothes, see if it fits with the rest of my, wardrobe. And then if it doesn't, I'll just go back to the store. And my friends just kept, they keep doing this. And it just very weird to me because I usually pay debit. So it's harder then to get reimbursed. But obviously with credit, it's very easy. Is that something you've noticed? Is that something you do?
This is not at all something I do. This might be more of the sort of the non-American half of me where I also find that behavior kind of strange, to be honest. Or I'm just like, what are these people doing? No, I mean, for me personally, I'm not at all that way. Not to get into like my whole who am I and my identity, but I've always felt there's a little bit of that sort of little split with me between sort of the core like American things, and then more of the sort of Anglo-European kind of how do I live my life stuff, where I've never been exactly like. It was one woman who was she was from Venezuela when I lived in New York. The way she described it is, I wouldn't think of Chris and this other guy, Mark, who is also British American. I wouldn't think of them as your default American boys, is how she put it. I would very much agree with it. Yeah. And this would be an example of that, where I'm like, to me, that just seems like a crazy concept where I'm like, that's a different culture than something I would do, which is I would go to the store, I would try things on there, and then I would buy the thing. And then, yes, if there was a major problem with it, or it was like a present, and you're not a little kid, and it's like, okay, this shirt doesn't fit. It's Christmas, the shirt doesn't fit. All right, we got to take it back. Yeah, obviously you'll do that.
Yeah, exactly.
But the concept of just, I would buy something and then I'll just frivolously do whatever and then just be like, I'll just return it anyway. I couldn't imagine something like that. But that doesn't, knowing, to go into American stereotypes, knowing Americans in big cities, that doesn't shock me at all. That they would do something like that.
So it's not just me.
It's not. It's probably, that sounds right. I can't confirm.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, it's been a pleasure, Suzon. And thanks everyone for listening. And we'll see you next time.